Right, welcome everyone to the Science and Religion Forum Conference 2020. My name is the Reverend Dr. Gillian Strain. I'm the chair of the Science and Religion Forum for my sins. My day job is I run a charity called the Guild of Health in St. Raphael, and I brought you all free copies of our journal over there, so do help yourself so I don't have to carry them home. So welcome to our speakers, welcome to members, and welcome to not members yet type people, no pressure, but there's some new faces as well in the room, so absolutely welcome to you. And for those who've been before, isn't it nice to be back together? It's familiar faces. 2 years, we were online last year, we were online the year before, but I was just having tea with people. I was like trying to remember what was the last, what year is it to begin with? And then what year was it that we last met together? We last met together in 2019. Do you remember? We were up in Durham looking at AI. I've got them written down. The year before Westminster, I think it was education and science and religion. The year before that, 2017, mental health. And I think 2016, do call me out, I've got no shame. I think we were here. 2016. Anyone remember the topic? I couldn't either. Doesn't matter. It'll come back. I remember being here, and it's so good to be back together again. So at the very beginning, I want to do what you normally do at the end, and thank the committee for organising this conference, because it's been a huge amount of work. We've got Finn. I'm sure you have had emails from Finn. He's the conference secretary, the worst job of the committee. So thank you to him. We've got Nathan, who is our treasurer. Pointing at Nathan. We've got Hilary, who's our membership secretary, and we've got other people on Zoom as well that are part of the committee as well. So thank you for them for organising this conference. So as many of you know, it's the Science and Religion Forum was formed back in 1975 by, amongst others, Arthur Peacock, who was the first chair and then later the first president as well. So we've a long established tradition within the science and religion field to bring together scientific thought with religious thought. And I'm going to quote from our own website. Why do we do this? Why do we bring them together? For close attention and continuing reassessment. I quite like that, because that's exactly what we do. Close attention, so the papers we have are often at a really high level. Not always, but really high, really top-notch stuff. We get the best to speak for us. But in the room, a real mixed crowd. People who are engaged in parish ministry, who are engaged in education, who just engaged in life. So for me, I always think that SRF, it's where the tire hits the road kind of stuff. Is that the right metaphor? That's what's in my head anyway. It matters because we bring the two together. The really great thoughts, the original thinking, what's happening today, what's new? Let's discuss it with the people who are doing something on the ground. And I think that's what makes SRF so important, especially today. We're just coming out of the pandemic where, science took a hit, right? People of faith took a hit. We shut the churches from the Christian perspective. Actually, SRF is needed more than ever if we think about how we need the best thinkers to be engaging with those who are on the ground in a real way. So welcome. Our title for this year's conference is Information and Reality, Questions for Science and Religions. And the metaphor, looking through the program, is there's a really rich buffet. I think I'm quite hungry. I'm going for food metaphors today. The food's really good here as well, isn't it? Really great keynote speakers. I'm very excited about our Gowland lecturer, Niels Gregersen, who's flown all the way in from Copenhagen to speak to us tonight. So one of the highlights, and I can't wait for that this evening as well. But also, you've got to pay attention, right, to the program. It's not that, it's a bit complicated. We need to use our minds, because we've also got short papers, we've got new voices, and we've got a Peacock Prize essay as well. So we've got a whole host of things to choose from. And I don't know if you're like me, but I've already looked through and wished I could defy the laws of physics and be in two places at one time, because I want to hear them all. But we're going to choose. But we're recording everything, aren't we? It's all going. If you can't go to one, or you miss something, you always go back, and we hope to publish. Members in the room, we have our AGM. Okay, when I hear AGM, I usually want to go to sleep. I go to lots of AGMs, but you must come. It's really important, and we've got the normal papers, find out what's happening, but there's an opportunity to have a voice as well and help us shape this organisation. Okay, so it's not until Saturday, today's Thursday, right? It's not until Saturday. What I'd love to know, so you can be thinking over the next 48 hours, topics. What could we engage with? What would you want us to get great speakers? What do you want to discuss with peers? What's the topics are in your head? Now, I can't make any promises, we obviously can't do everything, but do come to the AGM and tell us what you think would be good. And also, we're going to begin a 2-year period. We've had 2 years COVID. Let's look ahead to the next 2 years and think about membership growth. When I was a curate in the Diocese of London, I remember coming to an event and saying, oh, there's not many people here. And my training come and said, why are you talking about the people who aren't here to the people who are here, Gillian? That's a really rubbish way to do it. But we normally have much bigger numbers, and I want us to think about growth. Now, this is not a financial thing. This is not, oh, let's just keep this thing going because we all, Arthur Peacock started it, we can't let it fail. It's not about that. What we do here, I think, is really important. So we're going to enter into a period of 2 years of really trying to grow our organisation. In terms of networks we can work in terms of individuals who should be here, who we might benefit learning from, who they might benefit hearing from us. So come to the AGM, please, or else it'll just be me talking in a room, and come with your ideas. That would be really wonderful. I'm going to hand over to Finn now, who's in charge of all the important stuff like logistics and meals. So welcome and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Gillian, and apologies to those of you that are joining us on Zoom for the next 10 minutes or so. So, usual things, fire evacuations. If we hear an alarm, we are not expecting a fire drill, so please leave by the nearest fire exits and assemble on the grass the other side of the dining room, I've been told. That way. Please be aware that for those of you that are residential, after 8 o'clock, the only staff on site are the security team. So if you need anything, they will be in the office at the front here, like if you lose your key or your key doesn't work, but there won't be general staff around after 8 o'clock at night. It's to remind you that Woodbrook is a smoke and alcohol-free venue. Please do respect this. And there is a smoking area in the courtyard, I think is towards the quiet room that way, and potentially at some meals, if there are any Quaker groups in this weekend, there may be a slight pause or reflection before the meal, so please respect this if it happens when you are in there. Food, very important. Everyone here today is invited to join us for dinner after Beth's keynote and before Niels' public lecture, so please don't run off. It's included in your ticket price even if you were a non-residential attendee. Tea and coffee, ignore the lies on the programme. It's not in the Randall Harris room. It is available 24/7 in the dining room, so you're not restricted only to your 15-minute sections. And there are also cakes there in the afternoons, and I know some of you have found the cakes and some of us haven't yet. We have just heard about the cakes. Day guests, if you can please make sure you sign out before you leave. That's really important, but you can keep your lanyards for tomorrow, provided you're coming back tomorrow. So they are probably my big sort of logistics. Gillian's already mentioned the New Voices session tomorrow, which we would really like as many of you to support as possible. It's a really interesting group of 4 presentations happening there. And yes, the short papers will be recorded, so you will be able to catch up on the short papers that you couldn't get to, so don't panic too much. I think that is probably it. Oh, no. There is a social on tomorrow, Friday. I was having a brief moment of what day is it. So tomorrow evening at about 7:30 we are going to gather in reception and make our possibly slightly weary way down to the Bear and Starve, which is about a 15-minute walk that way, back towards Selly Oak. So that way, it's about a 5-minute taxi for those that would prefer to get a cab. So yeah, meeting about 7:30 out the front. So that is probably it for logistics, unless I'm looking at Gillian, I've missed. Hashtag. If you are on Twitter, it is very difficult to remember our hashtag. It's hashtag SRF2022. Anything else? I think that's it, isn't it? So in that sense, and excuse me for reading this off my phone, but I'm not organised enough to have printed this in advance. It is my great pleasure to be able to welcome our first keynote speaker, Dr. Beth Singler, who is a junior research fellow in artificial intelligence at Homerton College, the University of Cambridge. And prior to this, she was the postdoctoral research associate on the Human Identity in an Age of Nearly Human Machines project, which sounds very interesting, at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. And she's been an associate fellow at the Leverhulme Centre in the past as well. Beth explores the social, ethical and philosophical and religious implications of advances in artificial intelligence and robotics. As part of her public engagement work, she's produced a series of short documentaries and appeared on Radio 4's Today, Sunday and Start of the Week programmes discussing AI, robots and pain. She was also one of the Evening Standard's Progress 1000, the list of the most influential people in various fields, which I think is very impressive, in both 2017 and 2018. And in 2020, she was one of the 21 to watch, the top 21 entrepreneurs, inventors and thinkers in the east of England. Sorry, I should have made this bigger. It's all right. But basically, I think she's got a really, because you're now getting really embarrassed, aren't you? It's the problem where they're like, give me a bio, and you're like, no, I don't want to give you a bio.
I sent you to my website one, which is the longest.
But I think what that tells us is we've got someone who is very experienced in what she's about to talk about, and to give us a really different perspective. I know you said you're nervous because you are not a theologian, but I don't think that matters. And as Gillian was saying, it's about bringing voices together, and we are really looking forward to hearing your voice today. So over to you.
Thank you. I'd just like to start by saying thank you for this opportunity to speak to all of you here in the room and people watching in on Zoom. I don't know how many, maybe one or two. I want to start, thank you for the introduction, which came from my website far too long. I should have just said, just cut it off at this point. But yeah, there's a long list of stuff on there you don't need to cover. But I will start by just talking a little bit about my methods, because I think that's relevant, as I said, as Finlay said, that I'm not a theologian, I'm not a scientist either, I'm more of a social scientist, I'm an anthropologist. Is this clear enough to see? I hope people can read this. It's a bit tricky. Maybe the lights could help. Mostly because I want you to enjoy the GIF of someone playing with a robot, but also because you might want to read some of these things. Yes, okay, so I'm an anthropologist primarily. My degrees are all in theology and religious studies, but I've always been more the religious studies side. My PhD was looking at the New Age movement in particular, and then since then I've moved into thinking about artificial intelligence. Anthropology primarily involves participant observation, something that's been really difficult in the last couple of years, but luckily I'm also a digital anthropologist, which I'll talk about as well. But that means being in field sites, being in places where people interact with artificial intelligence and robots, and that's why I mentioned the GIF of a lovely child there playing with a small robot called Cosmo in Tokyo in a toy shop. I pay attention, as I say, to online discourse. I'm a digital anthropologist, and to do that, basically, I need to shape a boundary to that immense field site that is the internet. So not only do I pay attention to moments in the so-called real world, but I'm also looking at particular moments that spark conversation online. What Pink calls an ethnographic place formed by particular incidents, or an internet event, a moment in time, as Hein talks about. So this is just a little bit of a background of how I bound that space. I have a narrative focus. I'm primarily interested in people's conversations, how they interact with the concept of artificial intelligence, which means I also look at science fiction, the press, media, transmedia. I do tend to bracket off metaphysical validity of truth claims. That's common to all anthropologists, apart from theological anthropologists who do something slightly different. So I'm primarily interested in description, but that doesn't mean I cannot reflect on the ethical implications and societal implications of what I'm talking about. Now that's the long-winded way of saying I spend a lot of time doing cool stuff and looking at cool stuff like science fiction novels, or looking at people's conversations on Twitter, or going to the London Science Museum to look at their exhibition on robots and just staring at people and looking at how they were looking at people at the robots. There's a couple of other examples there. Meme culture is very relevant to what I'm up to, and you might recognize some of the specific science fiction accounts that I'm interested in if you're a geek like me, like Star Trek and so forth. But that's a big summary of what I'm up to, but we want to get into the meat of the talk and talk about this concept of deepfaking. Some of you might be familiar with the technology, but I also want to use the concept as a metaphor for how we are extrapolating from some data to come to other conclusions. So deepfake technology takes a large corpus of examples and extrapolates from that an output. Like most machine learning algorithms, that's the ultimate aim. But in this instance, as with this case study here, you can take a specific video of someone speaking, have a large corpus of examples of someone's face, and then combine the two so that it looks like that other person is saying the things that the first person was saying. And that's why there's a lot of concern about deepfake technology, because it can lead to misinformation. You could have, as in these lines, you could have someone saying the same thing as Obama or the same thing as Trump, but it could be Theresa May or it could be Putin. There's that combination of sources. To extend that metaphor a little bit further, this image I used on my very first slide comes from a piece of technology called DALL-E. If anyone's familiar with the Pixar film WALL-E, there's a little bit of a pun there around Salvador Dali and DALL-E, which I enjoy, but no one else seems to get it. Okay, so this works on a similar sort of principle, that in taking a large corpus of images, DALL-E can then extrapolate from a textual input. In this case, this image is the eye of God shining down on the world. So DALL-E is taking, and I have to be very careful not to use very personified language, but it's one of the limitations of human speech that I will talk about DALL-E learning or taking or doing. But this is an output based on that specific linguistic input, and there's a description there from OpenAI how this works. It's the next step on almost from the generative language systems like GPT-2 and then GPT-3 that showed you could take a small amount of textual material with a large corpus behind it and then extrapolate an output. So if you were a lazy academic, maybe, you could start your paper with a few sentences that were relevant to your topic and then see what the generative performance output was to get several paragraphs or an entire article. It's not always very successful. It does come out with some very interesting grammatical accidents and conceptual accidents as well. But again, it's this idea of extrapolating from data. This is another example that I find particularly interesting. This is AI religion bot. So a bot on Twitter is an automated tweet generator. In this instance, it's a combination of both textual generation. That first section has come from a corpus built on, as it says, corpus of world religion texts using GPT-2, a simpler version of GPT-3. Then it produces outputs that employ the same style, themes, and vocabulary as the source material and combinations thereof. So this is completely original text, but relying on a body of religious texts that have been inputted into the system. Then it goes further and takes that text and generates an image in the same way that the image was generated before. And in this instance, you know, you can see the style of that there is sort of matching the description above it. So basically, I'm talking about how AI generates images, texts, and ideas based off a corpus of very limited, sometimes, data, and what we get out of that can be quite, to some people's minds, creative, but it is still limited by that initial input. And I want to use that as a metaphor going forward as I discuss how we understand AI and how we sometimes slip into theistic understandings of AI. And that's a we in a very broad sense, and I'll talk about specific examples. So I want in this talk to deal with some big questions, and I won't answer these entirely, but they might also generate some further conversation, which would be really useful. I'm going to start with the basics. What is AI? I'm sure some people in this room have a very good understanding, and some people listening in on the Zoom as well. but I want to expand on my understanding of what AI is in particular reference to this talk. What imaginaries are currently finding expression in our conception of AI, so particular instances of how we understand AI, and how is AI's agency / super agency and even godhood being deep-faked? This is the core of my talk today, that it's being generatively extrapolated from the real data about its actually very narrow capabilities, and then providing an illustration of AI as God. And what does that disinformation mean for religion and religious creativity? Some rather big questions, but I'm going to touch on examples for each of them. So when it comes to what is AI, I think this is a self-selecting group that may have a pretty good understanding of what it is and how we interact with it, but it's just useful to be aware that people in general don't have a high level of education about what artificial intelligence is. Now, this is from a survey from 2017, so we could probably update it and the figures might be a bit different. But Pega ran this survey with 6,000 consumers to examine how many thought they interacted with AI on a daily basis, and actually how many did based on the technology that they had either in their phones or their use of social media and other places. So you can see a large discrepancy that 33% thought they did, but actually it was 77%. So there's not only a lack of transparency in what AI is doing, people don't know where it is and when they actually interact with it. So going back to that fundamental question, what is AI? Well, I'd like to start with thinking of it as a central technology, an actual thing in itself, an object we can indicate towards. It has several sort of sub-aspects, subdivisions. You may have heard of some of these. Machine learning. It can be used in speech recognition, natural language processing, which is similar to the GPTs I was talking about. It's used, or has been used. Expert systems aren't as predominant as they were. The most common conception is usually in something like embodied robots. But these are all different aspects of what people generally term artificial intelligence. And I like this graphic. It's not actually mine, because it draws attention to some of the conceptions of AI straight away, that we already have this idea of a synthetic brain or machine mind, and out of it is all the different aspects that AI is doing. So we are already being informed and shaped by our illustrations of what artificial intelligence is. So I have my own. I think of artificial intelligence as more of an onion, which, if anyone here is also a fan of Shrek, I'm going to throw in all the pop culture references. The ogres are onions, but so are artificial intelligences. And within this outer sphere, is it going to be able to be visible? Actually, it's not. I might have to read these because you can't really see it very clearly, unfortunately. So around the object that we say is AI, the technology that's being used in various different formats and different platforms, are things like charismatic authorities, different voices in the public sector, in this public sphere, that are telling you what artificial intelligence is. A big one would be someone like Elon Musk. Commercial hype, the people who want to sell you particular versions of AI are going to talk about it being very advanced in particular ways. Science fiction narratives are one of my favorites because I am an absolute geek, but we inherit a certain number of ideas about what AI is from our stories. Utopianism and dystopianism connected to science fiction narratives, either our extreme hopes or extreme fears, and where they come about and what influence they have. Religious narratives, another particular interest of mine, is that there are continuities, and I'll talk a bit more about those. Phobots being fake robots, when actually what we're being presented with are not actually artificial or automata, but actually there are humans somewhere in the system presenting the AI or the robot as more successful than it actually is. Done that one. Anthropomorphism, our tendency to see the non-human as human-like, and I counter that with robomorphism, the tendency to see humans as machines. Those two things are interlinked. The more that we see AI as human-like, there's a tendency then also to see humans as machines and treat them as such. So, all these aspects of the outer layer of the onion together give a sense of what artificial intelligence is to the general public, that actually it's more successful than it currently is, that it's closer to what might be termed general AI or artificial general intelligence, that it might already have human level intelligence, that it might in fact be super intelligent in some way, that it might already have achieved things like consciousness, that very nebulous, difficult term, but it comes up in conversations a lot, and that actually we're on our way to this thing called the technological singularity, that I want to talk a bit more about later, but it's worth mentioning that it can include other technologies like mind uploading, nanotechnology, and even theories about the simulation. Yes, I covered all the bits of the onion. Right, so in the history of AI, there is a very distinct aspiration, hope, and even what I call a telos for where it was going to go. So the term doesn't really arrive until 1956, although there is a whole history of cybernetics and other disciplines that were brought together by these 10 figures for a particular conference in 1956, the Dartmouth conference, that they had this rather ambitious, I'm rather impressed by it, research proposal that a 2-month, 10-man study of artificial intelligence would proceed on the basis of the conjecture that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that machine can be made to simulate it. They thought they would solve this thing they were calling artificial intelligence within 2 months with 10 people, which I think is rather impressive. And we're still actually in this process. Everyone who's working on artificial intelligence are still aiming basically for this direction. And I think that sort of perspective comes about partly because they had a very specific view of what intelligence is. And Robert Walensky in 1985 sums it up brilliantly. He says, speaking of these sort of 10 figures and others, computer scientists looked around at who the smartest people were, and they were themselves, of course. They were all essentially mathematicians by training, and mathematicians do 2 things. They prove theorems and play chess. And they said, hey, if it proves a theorem or plays chess, it must be smart. So we're going into this project not only with a huge ambition of solving intelligence, basically, which Google DeepMind still has as their sort of unofficial motto, solve intelligence, solve everything else later, with these sort of very narrow conceptions of what intelligence is and how it works. And this leads on to conceptions of the direction of travel that are very narrow as well. So this graph here marks the exponential growth in computer processing power over decades, and it was first sort of recognized as a phenomenon by I.J. Moore in 1965, and others since have carried on this arrow to check where we are going and how fast we are going there. I like this graph in particular because it's wonderfully out of date. It actually predicts, I can just about see it, I don't know if anyone else can see it, that by 2015 our computers would be as smart as a rat, and then by 2023, next year, we're nearly there, that computers would be as smart as a human. So that's the brain at the end. So there's this very exponential view of where we're going and how quickly we're going to go there, to the extent that it actually then predicts further on from that we'll reach what's known as it says in point 3, the singularity or the technological singularity, that the intelligence of artificial minds will be so great it will be beyond basically human comprehension, and that's predicted by some by 2045. So some coming, apparently, allegedly. This is the mythos that we're working with. In public discourse, this hasn't directly impacted conversation at the kind of common level, but it's there in a lot of the discussions about AI at sort of expert level. But still, we see this conception of AI getting smarter and smarter, more and more powerful, to the extent that there's a sort of overlapping of the omnis, the omniscience and the omnipotence that have been ascribed to other entities, and I'll get to those in a moment, previously now being ascribed to AI. It sort of sits in that middle space. And it matches, as I say, in public discourse, a very simplistic view of what God is, that he or they or she, in different interpretations, fulfills this space in the overlapping of these 3 different categories, including omnibenevolence. Now, AI doesn't necessarily partake of the top one in a lot of public discourse. This is not directly due to, but it can be explained by Nick Bostrom's orthogonality, I struggle to say that word, orthogonality thesis from 2012. So I'm saying this is not directly impacting public discourse, but this is one of the explanations, that it holds with some caveats, he says, that intelligence and final goals or purposes are orthogonal axes along which possible artificial intellects can freely vary. More or less any level of intelligence could be combined with more or less any final goal. I just mentioned I have an assistant on my PowerPoints. PowerPoint now uses machine learning to suggest particular images for your content. So this is the robot that popped up when I put this in. He's watching. So this is the sense that smarter and smarter AI doesn't necessarily mean more and more good AI. So going back to that initial Venn diagram of AI, there's a question mark over that space that would have been omnibenevolence in the diagram of God. And into this space, we see a lot of conversation about how we might fix AI that's coming, the superintelligence, the fastly arriving, more advanced AI, by doing projects on value alignment, making sure it has the same ethical concerns and moral status as humans, and something called friendly AI, which is again a suggestion of how we might align it to our needs. It doesn't necessarily just mean it's going to be cheerful and nice to talk to. And this is a space in which all our fears about dystopia and our hopes for utopia tend to arise. Now, this isn't necessarily new. In fact, although the term artificial intelligence arises in the 1950s, we were already talking about the potential for artificial minds and artificial life before then. You can go all the way back to Greek mythology, talk about Aristotle and his description of tools rising up with minds. But probably the most influential is Karol Čapek's play R.U.R. in 1920, which gave us probably first interpretation of a robot rebellion, a robopocalypse, that actually the entities that were created decided to rise up against their masters. And it's also where we get the term robot from the Czech, Slavonic word meaning labor or arduous work. And it's an interesting example because it also describes how we might reflect on human identity and human nature through consideration of the artificial. So from the quote at the bottom from one of the characters says, "O Domin, nothing is stranger to man than his own image." The embodied AI, the robot, is actually forcing us to think more about our human nature. But by the time we get to the 1980s, this robopocalypse narrative is very dominant in science fiction. If you've ever watched any of the Terminator films, you're familiar with Skynet, which is a defense system that's basically turned on and immediately decides that humanity is the biggest threat to its own existence, and then releases nuclear weapons so we all, pretty much all of us, get destroyed. This has a huge influence on our narratives in popular culture, but also public discourse. This is just a small sampling of the number of articles on artificial intelligence that use the Terminator imagery. I spoke to one journalist about this, and he said, robots are too static, bit of an oxymoron, but they need something that comes with emotional baggage in order to sell an article on artificial intelligence, and that quite often is this very dystopic version of what's going to happen with robots and artificial intelligence. This has a direct impact on people's concerns, their hopes and fears when it comes to AI, and I don't know how clear this is, but these are just a few samples of where I've looked at AI anxiety in Twitter, in particular tweets and public discourse, that actually people talk about how they're super afraid of artificial intelligence and robots, that a particular thing or a storyline has happened and I'm scared, someone says. There's hashtag robopocalypse. The meme at the end is one of my favorites. It's something like, I'm not scared of a computer, sorry, I can't read it from here. I'm not scared of a computer passing the Turing test. I'm terrified of one that intentionally fails it. So already deducing that there might be something that's smarter than us can actually destroy the test we have for its smartness. Now, of course, dystopian interpretations are not the only responses in those in that uncertain space of the future of AI and its omnibenevolence. We also get hopeful responses. Here's just a few that talk about how AI might be better at making decisions than humans, that actually this is something we might aspire to. Again, they're really hard to read, but it's things like, I trust AI more than I trust people. I'm honestly not afraid at all. I honestly believe I don't have a shred of fear for AI or what the future of AI will bring. The one on the end, I mentioned Elon Musk earlier, directed to Elon Musk saying, can you hurry up and bring AI about because we need to sort this current situation out. So this is the way that we get past all our current civilization problems, and we really have a future of human flourishing. Now, to briefly summarize, I think what's happening here is that AI is sort of falling into a space where it's mysterious, tremendous, and fascinating to people, and this is an expression that people may be familiar with, but actually it's falling into that kind of God space that exists already in our narratives and our tropes. And I want to introduce two particular case studies that really drill down into this. This is work that I've done that really demonstrates how people imagine AI in that God space. So I want to talk about two case studies: the AI creation meme, where AI is assumed to have agency because it will be created like us, and the blessed by the algorithm tweets is the corpus I've looked at, where AI not only has agency but actually seems to have super agency and is even deified by people in their conversations about it. And I use these two pictures because they came up when I was searching for images of AI making decisions. So again, to give you a sense of the way in which we illustrate AI is coming about through various different pre-existing narratives and tropes and forms that we're familiar with. So you will be familiar, I assume, with the creation of Adam in the Sistine Chapel. It's a very, very familiar piece, but it's also very mimetically vibrant and fertile, in which I mean it is reformatted in so many different ways. These are just 4 of my favorites. So you've got, you know, the segments of a Satsuma, paper clips. Pastafarians have done their own version with the flying spaghetti monster, and for these it's not post, sorry, I'm going to retract that. These COVID times, the Dettol spray meme as well. So we're familiar with this imagery, we know it can be remixed, and I looked in particular at its remix as an AI creation meme. So one instance here, but it's used in AI discourse, it's all over the place. For instance, a European Commission document used a version of the AI creation meme back in 2018. I looked at 79 examples from Google searches and on social media, and I found it to be an example of a religious meme and of a demonstration of contemporary lived religion. This is how people are doing religious expression online. And it brings into question the religious secular boundary, as other religious memes do too, and speaks to what's known as the new visibility of religion. After assumptions about the decline of religion in the public sphere, we're still seeing these repeating imagery, narratives, tropes, and aesthetics. So here's a few examples. Some are more familiar than others, perhaps. There's a few, actually, I don't think it's on this slide, but I had one from Star Trek at some point. But they appear all over the place. And I looked at the different characteristics of them, that they have a certain sidedness. Which side is the AI on? Is it on Adam's side or the equivalent God side? I looked at the color palette, using work about the prominence of the color blue and what it means in our aesthetics, that it's ethereal, it's heavenly, transcendent. There's lots of different interpretations. I was talking to someone online just the other day who said it was all to do with nuclear reactors and the way things glow blue, and that became associated with technological advancement. Someone else mentioned Tron and the way the lighting worked in the film Tron and how that impacted our understanding of what blue was. But there's lots of different ways of thinking of that. I looked at the gender and race of the human hand. It does tend to be generally a white male hand, perhaps repeating the original artwork, but also because discussions of AI do tend to have very limited demographics and representatives. The background imagery, sometimes there was the spark of life, the representations of data, cities, vectors, all sorts of different things, and I looked at where the image was being used as well. And predominantly I was interested in the kinds of norms and values that were being shared by this religious meme, and came up with this sort of list that we're seeing a continuity of theistic narratives and tropes in public discourse. People considering the creation of AI as a profound event equivalent to the creation of man in Christian theology. Our role in that act of creation, because obviously if AI is being created, we are the creator, we are the human hand in that relationship, fitting into the God side quite often. It speaks to our relationship and responsibilities to that creation, if we were to proceed with creating AI in that sense. Could it also be parodying religion by remixing and memeing significant imagery? I think that's certainly true, and I think the fact that it appears, the Sistine Chapel, the artwork appears in so many different forms and so many different memes, there is a sense of parody. And it's representing AI as a being with agency, or perhaps more accurately, if it's in the God space, super agency. Now, the second case study I want to talk about is about a specific phrase that I found a lot on social media, where people talk about being blessed by the algorithm. The most predominant tweet in this corpus is what I call the Liv Coleman tweets that occurred back in 2018, where Keith Coleman, who was a VP at Twitter, he'd also worked at Google, talked about being picked up by a Lyft driver, and Lyft is like Uber, basically, a gig economy job where you pick people up for rides, taxi rides. And he said he overheard, from an awesome Lyft driver, "Today has been great, I've been blessed by the algorithm." Immediately had an eerie feeling that this could become an increasingly common way to describe a day. So the sense that the Lyft driver feels blessed, he's happy, because he feels like the algorithm has chosen him for some particularly good rides, and he's financially rewarded for that. And I looked at a corpus of 181 tweets between September 2014 and October 2019. Graph, obviously. The most significant line there is as a result of the Keith Coleman lift tweet that was retweeted and shared quite a lot. So really it only has a lot of impact, and this is a really small corpus, really, and we're talking in terms of social media and Twitter, it's like nothing, but it's the fact that that impact happened at that particular moment. And I looked at making a typology of the tweets to try and find out the distinct types. Some were about success or failure of the user's content on platforms that are algorithmically arranged, like they have recommendation systems, so if you go on YouTube, you're shown particular things. They are being blessed in what's being shown to them, so the synchronicity of feeling a particular way, and then the algorithm suggests a particular song for you. They're feeling blessed, as I say, working in a gig economy role, that they feel generally that they haven't actually said specifically what happened, but today I've been blessed by the algorithm. Some continued with specific religious content, so they use pseudo-religious or parody language, religious emojis and other hashtags that were religiously inclined. There were also negative tweets, feeling not blessed by the algorithm, or even nostalgic for a time before the algorithm controlled and blessed their content. And then there were the tweets that made specific science fiction references as well as referring to being blessed. I looked also at conceptions of why some people think that they have been blessed. Some talked about being lucky. That being said, YouTube creators are stagnant. This is a quote at the top. A few lucky souls are being blessed by the algorithm and get noticed. Most are left to rot. They talk about being chosen, and that's again why I'm talking about AI as being perceived as having agency, or in this case, actually super agency, that they have control over other people's lives. You have been blessed by the algorithm, the chosen one, or that they've been virtuous in some way to have been chosen. Clearly you've been spending too much time, sorry, I should take out rude words, browsing rubbish content. Only the most virtuous media consumers will be blessed by the algorithm. So in a sense, you have to behave in a particular way to be good, to be blessed by the algorithm. So again, I want to return to something I suggested earlier, that AI might be fitting into this empty God space. In the blessed by the algorithm tweets, we see users reaching for culturally familiar concepts and language to express their understanding of something that's apparently inexplicable to them. Why did I get shown this YouTube video? Yes, we can see it's the algorithm, but we don't know why the algorithm works in the way it does, or the general public generally doesn't. The answer can be simply capitalism, that there are certain values put on the algorithm's choices, but for many people, just seeing a YouTube video or a piece of music being suggested to them, they feel like something miraculous has happened. I want to be careful though, because I think there is a danger of supporting a rather strict version of a secularization thesis here, that there is or that perhaps there is a pathological interpretation of religion as fulfilling a need, that there is a hole for God, people stick AI into it, or that we always need something like religion. I prefer an interpretation that sees the blessed by the algorithm tweets as an example of the continuities of enchantment, that we are entangled ever in our conceptions of technology and AI in particular with a sort of spiritual view of the world. However, concern rises that granting such super agency, even metaphorically, to technologically mediated others like AI can lead to disinformation and harm. As ever, science fiction gets there first. I'm a big Westworld fan. I hope this is no spoilers for people, but in season 3, we're introduced to basically an AI mastermind called Rehoboam, as in the king, who sets the people at liberty, is the interpretation of that name, through which all the data of the human population of the world is being filtered, and it's making predictions about their life, to the extent that actually it's directing their lives in particular ways. So choosing careers for them, locating them near potential partners, so relationships develop, and also predicting who will not be successful and therefore not supporting them in particular ways. And there's a conversation had by two characters, Liam and Dolores, and I'll talk a little bit more about Dolores in a moment, where he says, and Liam is the son of the creator of Rehoboam, "My dad thought the biggest problem in the world was unrealized potential," Liam tells Dolores. He thought that if you could chart a course for every single person, then you can make the world a better place. A path for everyone, Dolores replies, and Liam nods. Now this is depending on your feelings about that, either dystopian or utopian. I think it's the interpretation in Westworld is pretty dystopian. But what's interesting is the conflict that arises between this algorithmic god and the androids of Westworld. Again, I hope no spoilers here, but Dolores is one of the androids who has escaped from the Westworld theme park, and she's tried to basically have her own agency, her freedom in the so-called real world. And she talks to a human character saying, you were free, humans were free, you had no god, so it's a particular atheist interpretation of the world, but you tried to build one, and that's Rehoboam. Only that thing you built isn't God. The real gods are coming, and they're very angry. And she's talking about the androids who've escaped from Westworld. So in our science fiction, as I say again, we're being primed in some ways to see superior AI in particular ways. And of course, science fiction is entertainment. We know this is a thing we choose to see, stories that we choose to tell ourselves. But for some people, there's a slippage between science fiction and science fact. And the idea of AI that guides our lives, as in Rehoboam, is not far off from some people's conception of where we're going with the technology. So this is an article from, it's hard to say, I think it's from a couple of years ago. Will artificial intelligence soon tell us how to live? What people don't realize is that we are on the verge of a paradigmatic shift in thinking on par with the Copernicus revelation, says Dr. Angel Iskovich. The way we make our most personal decisions, from our partners to our health choices to, yes, even our daily routines, is going to transform to the falling cost of data storage and rising computing power. According to him, in the future, AI will advise us how to structure our days for the most fulfilling life. It will literally tell us what to do for optimal living. So this is the science fiction come to reality, in a sense, that we will be able to quantify our lives to the extent that we could take advice from artificial intelligence systems. And of course, as I said, in the utopian visions that some people have, this is something to aspire to. And I'm returning again to a previous slide where people were talking about how AI is better at making decisions than humans. So in this case, if this is the scenario we're working towards, some people feel like this might be a better world than a world in which humans make decisions. Now, we're actually already in a situation where there is this ruling AI. It's just that we're not particularly familiar with it, and as I was talking about before, it's invisible to a lot of people. So this diagram shows the combination of both AI-created filter bubbles on social media and other platforms, and human-created filter bubbles, and how they work together to basically shape our experience in the digital realm. Now, I say all of this together is what's giving people the sense of being blessed by the algorithm. Both the actual algorithm working to recommend particular things, but also the social media bubbles that we create ourselves. And then we interpret that, we give it a narrative saying that this is something that's happening for us in a benevolent way. But we should always be aware that there are still humans in the loop making decisions about what we're seeing, that the algorithms don't just spontaneously generate and then make decisions for us. They are being implemented in particular ways. So this is a quote from Technology Review, and then backed up with a few details about a Facebook report. It says that in the run-up to the 2020 US election, Facebook's most popular pages for Christian and Black American content were being run by Eastern European troll farms. So humans in Eastern Europe in cohorts with algorithmic decision-making systems. And the report from Facebook, Jeff Allen says, our platform, through its algorithms, has given the largest voice in the Christian American community to a handful of bad actors who, based on their media production practices, have never been to church. So there's this influence that's coming from both algorithmic decision-making systems and humans as well in the loop. Now, it's important to be aware in talking about how we theistically interpret artificial intelligence that this can also be intentional. So I've mostly been talking about the unintentional slip of people seeing AI as a god, but there are intentional efforts in this direction as well. We need to be sensitive to those as well and understand how they come about and how we also ascribe to them. So I want to talk in particular about embodied AI religious intermediaries like Mindar here, or Mindar, I think it's Mindar actually, who is designed to look like the Bodhisattva canon. It recites a pre-programmed sermon about the Heart Sutra. I think it's actually, I don't know if I put it in there. No, it's in Kyoto in Japan, and it was made specifically for that Buddhist temple. It's not actually AI enabled, but it's often presumed to be. It's seen to be a general AI when people interact with it. And I'm just indicating again, this is an example of that onion, that we have the technology and that we have people's assumptions about it around it. But also, I mean, before we quickly slide, as some people do in this conversation, into an east-west dichotomy, saying, well, of course, it's Japan, they have a different relationship to robots because of their animistic culture, which is often the way the conversation goes, we need to think again about Western animism and religion and our Western conceptions of other than human persons, that actually we also are quite keen on robots. For instance, the Bless You Too bot here, the blessing robot, which was a part of an installation by the Protestant Church in Hesse and Nassau. Someone will correct my pronunciation, sorry. I'm learning German, I'm not very good at it. During the World Reformation exhibition in Wittenberg, Germany in summer of 2017. Now, this raises lots of questions. I think it was meant to be more of a provocation at the time to get people thinking about the future of the church, the future of automation, but it's reported as having blessed sort of in the thousands of humans who visited it. So we have to ask the question, how is the metaphysical nature of the blessing understood? Is this the same thing as being blessed by a priest, or is it something very different? Now, I'm not going to call myself qualified to determine that, and that's not my sphere, but we could raise the question, is this PR or is it piety? I like that as a short way of thinking about it. And I also look at AI new religious movements, so people who intentionally create new religions around technology, AI, transhumanism, and their view of the future. So not just thinking about religion and science, but how religion can come from science. This approach does require some agile, digital, and traditional ethnographic methods because they don't always last very long. In particular, the second on the list there, the way of the future. Actually, the first on the list, the Order of Cosmic Engineers, became the Turing Church, so you have to follow their progress and when they transform, but also the way of the future founded by Anthony Lewandowski, who was involved in the court case against Google, or with Google, recently closed down, but there is still a fan account still tweeting things like, a sufficiently advanced artificial intelligence would be indistinguishable from God. So it's still having some sort of minor-ish influence, but it isn't as active as it was. And then there's other groups like the Church of Perpetual Life, the Church of the Simulation, the Church of the Singularity, which I think that image at the top there is from there. The Church of Perpetual Life actually have a physical location. They're very strong transhumanists. I think it's in Phoenix, Arizona, and they share meals together, but they also then take rather a lot of vitamins and minerals together as an effort towards perpetuating their life. And then there's groups like the Mormon and Christian Transhumanist Associations. And what's significant about those is that they see themselves as returning to the fundamentals of those two more established religions. That actually both Christianity and Mormonism, in their perspective, is ultimately transhumanist. So this is a natural state to be involved in. It's not actually a schism, they're actually returning to fundamentals. Just to specifically look at the Turing Church for a moment, that they have a view of what they're doing as developing theism from deism. So the concept that God is not present in the universe, but as they say, we will go to the stars and find gods, build gods, and become gods, and resurrect the dead from the past with advanced space-time engineering and time magic. So there's a lot going on there, but just basically the conception that this is a natural part of the progress of human civilization to develop these things through science and technology. And they see religion as a tool. As they say, we need new positive, solar action-orientated spiritual movements based on science to keep us enthusiastic, motivated, and energetic as we take the first steps towards the cosmic frontier. So they see religion as a useful tool towards transhumanist ideals. Now, it doesn't just involve new religious movements when people start coming up with new conceptions of AI as a religious object. Some of you may have been familiar with, or may have come across Yuval Noah Harari's work. He's a historian. He takes a rather long-scale approach to history and talks about where we're going. So in particular in Homo Deus, he argues that what might replace desires and experiences, he asks what might replace desires and experiences as the source of all meaning or authority. As of 2016, there is one candidate sitting in history's reception room, waiting for the job interview. The most interesting emerging religion is dataism, which venerates neither gods nor men. It worships data. Now again, he's not setting out to start a new religious movement unlike the previous groups, but he's identifying what we treat as religious. This is based on his very pragmatic account of what religion is. So it's a tool, again, we've seen that description before. It preserves social order, it allows for cooperation, it's a deal, whereas spirituality is a journey. It gives a complete description of the world and offers a well-defined contract with predetermined goals. It seeks to cement the worldly order, whereas spirituality seeks to escape it. So he sees our obsession with data as fitting into these criteria for what he calls a religion. Now, even though he's not setting out to start a religion, he's giving people an identity, a way of being religiously creative that people are then ascribing to. So, for instance, this tweet from 2017, so about a year after his book, not sure if I'm a techno-humanist or a dataist, not sure if it matters either. So even though he's not intending to create a specific religious movement, he's giving an idea for people to hang off of. And again, religious creativity can happen. So to summarise, I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but I'm probably running close to done.
No, you've got time if you would like to.
Okay, well, I'm in the summary stage, and then we can go to questions, but I just want to tackle what I've said, just in case it wasn't clear. So I started by describing deepfaking as a technology, but also as a metaphor, that we can understand it as an approach to extrapolating from basic data to something more creative. And we're seeing something like that with people's understanding and description of AI, that we have what it is in its narrowest sense, and then around that, all those elements that I talked about in the outer skin of the onion are leading people into seeing it in particular ways. And my interest is in how people end up seeing it as a theistic entity, as a god in essence. This move, though, as I argue, relies on a presumed direction for AI, that there's a telos that from its very inception we were going somewhere with it. Smarter and smarter, more and more powerful, but as I say, not necessarily more and more good. So concerns arise in that omnibenevolent space that if we cannot ensure good AI, we'll get sort of dystopic outcomes. Skynet comes up again and again, as I said. And then this can overlap with public conceptions of a monotheistic God, but with limitations, as I say, without that omnibenevolence. Thus, deepfaking happens both intentionally, so groups that want AI to be a god, or want to see their deity incarnated in a robotic form, such as the avatars we were talking about. And it also happens unintentionally, as in the blessed by the algorithm tweets, that in that empty space of not understanding AI, we bring in lots of narrative ways of interpreting it, and in this instance, feeling that we've been blessed by it. And then also in ways that partake of both. The AI creation meme, people intentionally pick that imagery to evoke particular norms and values about what it means to create something. But also, even in secular spaces, it unintentionally inspires people to think of AI as more significant than it is, more created than it is in a divine sense, and to actually relate it to the theological stories that they already have. And then specific intentional attempts to make AI gods, such as in the new religious movements I've talked about, expresses particular forms of religious creativity in an age of new technology. We've always done this. Every time a new technology arises, new religious movements arise around it. Spiritualism was very much related to the development of the telegraph and the concept of communication at distance. And we see similar things happening with the development of AI and its inspiring of new religious movements. However, as I said before, the danger is that believing that AI is a god can obscure actual uses of AI which are not godlike at all, that actually can cause societal harms, that are ethically dubious, that involve inequality, abuses, all the elements that we should be worried about before we start worrying about the Terminator. So finally, I want to leave you with this quote. I think it's particularly evocative. I love Thomas Dish's book from 1998, "The Dreams Our Stuff is Made Of, How Science Fiction Conquered the World." And he says, "In dreams begin responsibilities, but it's no less true that in dreams begin irresponsibilities. The menu in terms of our possibilities in both those respects is well nigh infinite. That we can go either way, but we have to be careful." So I will end there. I don't know what I'm doing on time, but there's my details there as well if anyone wants to contact me afterwards and chat more and we can do questions. Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Beth. What I'll ask you to do is when we get questions from the floor, if you can repeat them, I'm really sorry,
Yeah, no
so
problem.
that people on virtually can pick us up. I think that was really interesting. I think it's been a really good, thought-provoking start to the conference. I'm going to take Chair's privilege and ask a question.
Okay.
Swap
Do you
over.
want me to go? Yeah, I'll go near the microphone.
Otherwise
Okay.
I'll end up with something.
So I have to repeat your one.
I think I'm okay here, aren't I, Matt? Yeah.
Okay.
I want to pick up on your idea of blessed by the algorithm and actually turn it the other way,
Mm-hmm.
and then kind of ask you from an ethical point of view. Obviously, we hear the kind of, oh, well, it's, you keep looking at pets and now you're getting YouTube videos for pets. But we also hear the other story of like, well, you've looked at negative content, and then there's nothing that comes in to break it, but like particularly on autoplay, this end up getting. What is our kind of ethical responsibility there? And is there a way that we should be acting on, I don't know, every 10 bad videos randomly? Purring kitten is insulting. I kind of wondered about, from an ethical perspective, what your thoughts were on.
Yeah, so that happens primarily because, as I say, algorithms don't have agency. They're not making choices, not choosing to bless you. What's happening is there's a certain weighting on your attention. So the more attention you show to videos, the more you will be shown particular things. Outrageous and fringe videos get more attention, and therefore, it's a cycle. It gets worse and worse. And the ethical question is, what is the responsibility of the corporation, as you say, to interrupt that? Well, it doesn't suit them, for a start. So we can say, yes, ethically, this is not a cycle we should ever encourage people into, because this is how things like radicalization happen, where people are shown particular things and get particular ideologies embedded in them. So we can absolutely say, yes, they should be regulated, and they shouldn't weight these fringe videos quite as strongly. There should be an algorithm that weights beneficial things. Now that seems to make sense, but the concern with that, there's a counter concern, is that when Facebook experimented, because Facebook has the opportunity to experiment with your perception of everything, and that's it's in the T's and C's, so you can't complain about it. But when they did, to try and make people happier, people did complain. So they felt they were being manipulated either way. It's just the manipulation of the YouTube algorithm is not to make you happy or sad, it's to make you watch, which they perceive as neutral, but we know those videos are not neutral. So yes, there's absolutely an ethical concern. We can respond to it and we can be strident about it, but these are private corporations. We have no rights to see good things and we have no rights to see bad things. We just have what they want in terms of attention leading to monetization, leading to their profit.
Thanks. I wish I hadn't asked.
Sorry.
Is this on? Okay. On that cheery note, folks.
Or just don't go on YouTube. I mean, there's the scorched earth interpretation.
One online. To what extent do you believe
Harari. Yuval Noah Harari, yeah.
Provides a plausible narrative for future human development, especially with regards to religion?
So, as I mentioned, he does have quite a utilitarian view of what religion is. He sees it as a technology, which to a certain extent I can agree with him, but I think he then draws very simplistic lines, much in the way we think of like the exponential curve. He then draws like exponential curves, and he relies a lot on some of the earlier interpretations of what religion is and how it progresses. So in the way that we used to talk in anthropology about the development from animism to polytheism to monotheism to rationality, that was the assumed line. Like David Hume does that line in his Natural History of Religion. He does something very similar. And I think if he'd probably engaged more with religious studies scholars and probably theologians as well, he might have done something a little bit more nuanced. But it is very much like humanity will outgrow this, but we'll obsess about something else, and it'll be data. And he's using religion he's using it as a cipher. It's just something that happens rather than a lived thing that people do.
Okay. Oh, wow. If I come to you first.
Thanks, Beth. I was wondering about the whole thing about kind of recreating God in our own image, which is, I think, is something of what we could be doing with AI.
Yeah.
Because you kind of evacuated the space of God in secular theory. Therefore, you need to replace that because of the enchantment stuff. And I just wonder, it's kind of this Deus ex machina kind of model, that we want to get a better version of God because God is, you know, a bit nasty and everything.
Yeah.
So therefore we want this kind of, because I don't know whether God is omnibenevolent, the Judeo-Christian God,
Yeah.
or any of the gods. So do we then want to kind of fashion a God who is the best form of humanity, as it were? And therefore we need to have that model, and we use AI to get there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think there's certainly, and I think that's why the AI creation movement is so impactful as well, because it's putting that relationship in a way that we understand with humans and the robotic form. No, I think that's true, and certainly some of the interpretations of things like the Internet of Things or the quantified self, and the article that I cited as well that talks about how AI will make all our decisions for us, I think there is a certain strand of thinking that says that's very reassuring. If we can create something that operates like a god to help us along, but doesn't have all this kind of mysteriousness or difficult interpretation of text, doctrine, perhaps doesn't even have a hierarchy of priests, but that could potentially develop. That's something that happens over time. You know, I'm talking in a Weberian sense of the routinization of charisma, that eventually there might be an AI priesthood. But at the moment, if you conceive of AI in that space as being all powerful, it's sort of reassuring that that's something that you've located yourself. You haven't received it through revelation. You've decided this is a thing. Yeah, I can see that certainly as a way of interpreting it.
Thank you very much. This was very mind-boggling and so much wonderful information that at once you have seen it before and still it's new. I mean, we are all aware of these AI processes. I wonder whether one could put it the other way around concerning Harari, seeing artificial intelligence as a tool. And then in the other end of the spectrum we have artificial intelligence as a sort of necessary end goal by this exponential curve. I came to think of a philosophical thought experiment by the American philosopher Robert Nozick in his book Life Examined. Then he said, imagine that we had a happiness machine. This would actually give you the benevolence. And the only condition was that if you enter it, you cannot go out of it again.
Right.
And then the question is, to all of us who are a little worried and sometimes also a little happy, it is, would you plug in? Because in a sense, then there is no route back.
Yeah.
That is, there is no distinction between artificial worlds and real world. There's no distinction between algorithms and reality, between computational complexity and real world complexity.
Yeah.
How do you think about that? What would?
Oh, that's really interesting. There's a couple of things that occur to me straight away. So first off, the idea of going the other way and say AI is just a tool. There are significant voices in the AI ethics, AI philosophy field who very much speak in that direction. So Joanna Bryson in particular, I think she wrote an article that was a bit problematic because she said AI should be slaves, and I think she's reformulated that slightly to talk about AI more as tools, that we should actually have an agenda that argues that we keep AI as narrow as possible, so none of this exponential growth into artificial general intelligence. We just see AI as a very simplistic tool that does specific things, and we don't go into the anthropomorphism. We have to find ways to regulate that and limit that as much as possible. A second thing that occurred is that amongst some of the transhumanist groups that I look at, they talk about raising the hedonic level of everyone. So not necessarily a tool that you plug in to make yourself happy, but actually genetic modification could raise the happiness level, the hedonic level for everyone. So you just start off from birth as being happier. And then there's concerns from the more kind of existential risk side, talking about AI, that if you programmed it, much like Nick Bostrom I think talks about this at some point, that if you programmed it to make humans happy and it didn't have common sense, didn't have the understanding of what it means to be happy, it might just go around making humans smile through surgery or something similar. So that's a concern. And then you talked about plugging in to be happy, reminded me, because I'm a sci-fi geek, Better Than Life in the Red Dwarf series, which is a simulated world that you like the Matrix. Matrix is probably like a more reasonable example for people who haven't grown up in the 80s. But in the Matrix, you are plugged into a simulation, and for the benefit of humans, they maintain a certain amount of happiness in the Matrix, right? The robots talk about, or whatever you want to call them, how some of the initial versions of the Matrix were too good. They were utopias, and human minds rebelled because we're not used to being so happy. So actually the Matrix that you see in the films is like just happy enough but not great. That's why Neo's an office worker, which really hits hard because I used to work in an office. So yes, you're right, that's not perfect utopia. So there's several different currents that coming together in that kind of philosophical argument, which I think is really interesting. And then you can pick out, as I've tried to do, some of the real world examples of where people are talking about elements of that.
Thank you.
Oh, hi.
The parallel between AI and the new God is fascinating. So just as a shameless self-plug, I make a similar parallel but with demonic intelligence. So if you like this and you want more of it, just come tomorrow to my short paper.
Because to pipe up, Elon Musk talks about warning us about the future of AI, saying we are summoning the devil or the demon. I think he says the demon.
But I want to draw you back to Harari, because I don't like it as a theologian, but still I find hard.
Don't like it as an
I really cannot put my finger where he's wrong, because he says that AI is becoming this oracle that we are trusting more and more, and we do that with the GPS. I mean, you make your own choice a few times, and then you realize the GPS knows better. You better trust it, and then you start doing that with career choices, with education choices, and so on. Harari suggests that you will do that also with relational choices, like who to marry, Bill or John, and the AI assigns probabilities of success. And you know that that is reliably good because it relies on so much data and statistics. And it seems to be that that is where we are going. And on the one hand, we don't like that because it means we are just ceding our free will. But on the other hand, we do that because it's more convenient. And I don't see any obstacle between this moment now and a moment when we will do that, unless maybe you think that reality doesn't lend itself to this kind of prediction. Maybe it's too complex to make this kind of predictions, but otherwise, what do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I always say, as an anthropologist, I recognize how messy life is. Like, we're not hard scientists, we're qualitative researchers. We rely on a methodology that, I mean, I like to tell some of my hard scientist friends, there's an ethnography of one person written in the 1970s. I think it's by Crapazano, I can't remember entirely. But yeah, and the idea that you could do an entire study on one person, but that's ethnographically really rich. It's amazing. It's so full of detail. So yeah, absolutely, I agree. I think the reduction that happens is not that it's actually possible to quantify everything. It's that we increasingly see everything as quantifiable. We reduce our width of experience. And I was talking about robomorphization very briefly, and one example of that would be you're applying for a job and you happen to know that they use an algorithm to assess CVs. So you alter your CV to match the algorithm. That's increasingly happening. There's videos on YouTube you can watch how to be influential on Instagram by pleasing the algorithm, basically. So we're seeing that kind of shift, and I don't actually think the human is entirely quantifiable in that way and reducible in that way. There was another thing I was going to say, and it's escaping me now, but maybe later it will come back to me. Yeah, I mean that's the Westworld argument in season 3 is that there is the capability of this superior AI that can make all its decisions for you. That was it. I remember now. Sorry, I remember what I was going to say. You mentioned dating, and one of the things that I don't think Harari recognizes is the role of capitalism in algorithms. So the algorithm for a lot of dating sites is not perfect, and intentionally so, because if you found your perfect partner, even if such a thing was possible, you would never go on the dating site again. So you wouldn't continue your subscription. I've spoken to people who've developed them. This is intentional. I actually met my husband on a dating site. We were not compatible by the algorithm, and maybe we're not anyway, but we're together. Sorry. But no, in personalities, we're very different. So in that sense, he doesn't take on board the socioeconomic elements that influence the design of algorithms. He just is thinking in a very context neutral sense that algorithms can do X, Y, Z, therefore they have outputs that are reliable, and that's not always the case. But you're right, humans will consider them to be more reliable than they are. Okay.
Thank you, I enjoyed that. lots of things going around in my mind, perhaps very old ones, but I was looking at parallels with 19th century philosophy of knowledge and power, Schleiermacher. And if we're with Schleiermacher, are we going to end up with Nietzsche?
I am not an expert on either of those. I think, no, I'm not sure I have the ability to answer that question. Can you define what you think you're getting from either of those?
The idea, well, power and knowledge are certainly linked in late 19th century philosophy. I always found Schleiermacher aggressive in a sense, subject and object, and the sort of ownership, and that led through, I'm simplifying, but Nietzsche ended up with a morality of power, which we can look at history, how far that influenced fascism, it may well have done. Are we in a similar position?
Again, I just don't think I have the capability to. I will say there's a strong, from an anthropological sense, there's a strong influence of Nietzsche on some of these narratives. The Übermensch of, transhumanism talks in that direction, definitely. And I mean, it depends how you define the boundaries of transhumanism as an ideology, but there's so much influence we can see on the exponential capitalists talking about AI and the direction the tech's going in. So that's the influence of Nietzsche there. Perhaps we could talk about it some later, and you can educate me a bit more about Schleiermacher.
Thank you, Dr. Singler, for the fascinating presentation. Picking up from the conversations that's been happening, you mentioned capitalism, and I came across a study by Zettel and Osinski, who kind of criticized the dominance of scientific perspectives, saying that there is an ideological pursuit that is being facilitated through technology, and they were specifically talking about science, but it's true with AI today, just as you said. And they even termed it, the school of Harvard Moscow. There is capitalism and authoritarianism both functioning together, so that so I realized that we're talking about human formation, what kind of people we become, what kind of cultures we become, and that can be dictated and formed, as you mentioned rightly, in the Facebook issue. So my question is this an area where perhaps theology and science should step in? Because as Rowan Williams says, science in itself does not have the method or the capacity to generate ethics. So perhaps to answer Dr. Reverend Strain, who asked that, could we have more topics? Do you think this is one question that we need to have as to how humans are formed and how we generate ethics, or find even categories of generating ethics through this conversation? Is that necessary? Because as James K. Smith says, cultural liturgies are literally forming people and minds and thought. So I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I think in the work that I've done in faith and AI, and in setting up particular workshops to bring together religious leaders to discuss AI, I've done some in the past, I'm probably doing some more in the future with another organization, but there's a sense in which, we need to recognize the value of hundreds, if not thousands of years of discussion of what the human is, how, as you say, how we formulate that, where our ethics come from. Like, we shouldn't be starting from ground zero is a terrible time. We shouldn't be starting from scratch in these conversations, but there's a certain sense of ahistoricism in the AI ethics community, because if they refer to things, they refer to philosophy, yes, but they don't generally refer to theology, because there is a sometimes quite strident distinction between doing philosophy and doing theology in those spaces. I went to an AI and society / sort of AI ethics event in New York, and actually saw the one person who was willing to write theologian on their badge be shamed for being a theologian by several people, and I found that offensive, when there's so much that could be added to the conversation from many different theological perspectives. So no, I agree with you. I think there's a necessity for that conversation, but the problem is both sides are going in with some biases that make that conversation quite difficult. Another example, not quite the same thing, but similar, there's a distinction that happens between the arts and humanities and the sciences when it comes to AI as well. There was a conference held in Cambridge 3-ish years ago where Google DeepMind came with some examples of their tech to demonstrate it particularly to arts and humanities scholars at Cambridge by invitation. And it almost, for academics, almost got quite heated. And there was a suggestion from one technologist that you arts and humanities scholars are just living in your ivory towers and you need to get down and start engaging with this. And it's like, well, we're here and we're trying to engage, but we're talking at cross purposes about what things like imagination means or creativity means. And you're saying one thing, but we're saying something, and trying to find the language that meshes those two things together. And I think it's even more difficult when you're talking about theologies because of people's presumptions about what that means. That already, because there's been some attempts at deontologically inspired ethics guidelines from particular religious groups that fit quite rightly into their cultural context, but then they can't be extrapolated out and used by other technologists because they don't agree with those cultural contexts. So I'm thinking in particular the Southern Baptist Convention wrote their maybe 10 rules for the future of AI, which was based on their biblical literalism, their view on things like sexuality, warfare, marriage, and all these elements, and related those to AI, but then those won't be adopted by anyone who don't have the same cultural background. So those sorts of cultural translation issues that are quite difficult, I think. But I absolutely agree. I think theology of many stripes is really informative to the conversations that we're having about AI ethics.
Thank you. I'm a theologian with a particular interest in the relationship between God and ethics, and I'm stuck with this omnibenevolence thing. I can't conceive why anybody should think that AI should be any more benevolent than the people who created it. And I'm kind of thinking to myself, before you do any AI, should you be obliged to do a course in ethics?
Yes. Straight answer, yes.
and I mean, I'm old enough to notice for myself how the latest new technology is always hyped as it's going to really change things. And in the long run, actually what it does is it gives more power to those who control it at the expense of those who can't. So why are we all presupposing that it's going to be benevolent?
Yeah, that's why, that's the space with the question marks in the public interpretation of AI. It's so uncertain, but I think that's the aspiration. That's where the hope and the utopianism comes in. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the Bostrom's orthogonality argument says it's not necessarily so, but just our narratives tell us it's not necessarily so. We keep telling ourselves this could go horribly wrong. Sometimes I relate that fear to a recognition that we get when we create our own other intelligences. When we have children, we recognize that at one particular point or another that they are independent agents from us. I have a son, I distinctly remember these moments, and it's there in our larger cultural narratives of saying this thing we create, AI in particular, could end up having separate agency to us, could go off and do various bad things, could be good, could be bad. And that's that uncertainty I think some people are trying to fill with particular narrative forms to reassure themselves that it will either be very good or, yes, it's reassuring to know it will be very bad. So no, I absolutely take your point on the question of omnibenevolence. And as I said quite quickly, yes, I think ethics is a very key component for the development of this technology. It's actually in some ways a sort of blind spot in the conversation. When I've talked to a few technologists at tech exhibitions, like marketing events, and the one particular person was showing me some technology for visual recognition with an AI system for planting fields. So it could recognize what crops were where and then determine what was going to go next. And I said, what are the other potential applications for this? And he just looked kind of blank. There are other applications for things that recognize where things are and does something to them, and he just hadn't sort of squared that in his head. So there are moves, there are different institutes now supplying AI ethics courses. The CDEI, the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation in the UK, is supported by the government to lead on making sure there's master's courses that people in AI can take that are specifically on ethics. So it's sort of slowly disseminating out there as a concept and the ability to do it as an add-on, but it's something that should certainly be there from the very beginning. I did a talk in a school to predominantly 17 and 18-year-olds, but then they suddenly asked me to go talk to kids in the lower school who were maybe 8 or 9, And they already had very distinct ideas of what robots could and should do. And some of them weren't particularly ethical. So I was a little concerned that we perhaps, even if we think about master's courses in AI ethics, we're not close to where we need to be starting the ethical conversation.
Hi, Beth. Yeah, good to see you again. There have always been influences on society that we haven't been aware of, haven't there? Things like propaganda, everyday marketing, some would say religious movements. So how do we distinguish between those kind of things? And I group AI into that, those unknown influences, where there are instruments as designed by someone versus either unintended consequences or kind of autonomous agency that's emerging, an emergent phenomenon. Because it's one thing to be annoyed that some malevolent force is designing something to influence us, because at least that can be deconstructed and someone can be blamed. But when the algorithm itself has gone haywire and has developed its own consciousness in the extreme, then that's an altogether different problem.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's slightly verging into a metaphysical question, which I'm not qualified to answer. We don't know at which point this thing that we call consciousness would appear in AI, or would it ever appear. I think the hazard is, as I say, is when we conceive of it happening before we know it's happened, and if we don't know that boundary, that's also a problem. But the narrative of these algorithms have gone haywire is already in our public discourse. I mean, Boris Johnson, what is it now, like 2 years ago with the A-level results, said this was caused by mutant algorithms that gone haywire, basically. He didn't say haywire. And he also spoke to the UN about the future of AI either involving, was it caring robots or pink-eyed Terminators? Now, I take offense that he doesn't know they have red eyes rather than pink eyes, but he's, as a figure, I talked about charismatic authorities like Elon Musk, but also, unfortunately, Boris Johnson is a charismatic authority. Saying these sorts of things about mutant algorithms gives a sense of natural evolution that they don't necessarily have at this point. The A-level algorithm that made predictions was designed by humans with particular, as I say, weightings. Weight was applied to particular outcomes. So the assumption that if you went to a school that didn't historically do well, you couldn't possibly do well either. That was built into that system. It wasn't an accident, it was a choice. So we need to be as educated as possible about what AI algorithms in particular can do right now before we start assuming that they can do more than they can. But yeah, then, as I said, it leads into a more metaphysical question of when would we know when they can do more than they can. I was just on Religion Media Center, what do they call them? I don't know, let's call it a panel. It was on Zoom recently, and Eve Poole, I think she's from Edinburgh, was talking about how she thinks in particular instances there are examples of consciousness in automata already, and she was talking about a particular instance of a system with visual learning processes choosing to change its focus to the faces of the people experimenting with it. And I haven't found the source for that yet. I want to explore that a bit further. And that's either something that actually happened and our interpretation of it is a narrative that tells us it was a choice, in the way that there was a conversation about a year or two back about algorithms talking to each other in a strange language humans don't understand. That might be us telling us a story to understand what's happened, or it might be a technological advance that indicates something like consciousness. And it's very hard, as I say with the onion, it's very hard to unpeel those layers and get to what's actually happening. And that's the problem of subjective experience anyway. So yes, I think that's a really multifaceted question, but what we need at the moment is realism about where the technology is, and not Boris Johnson talking about mutant algorithms amongst other things he's been doing lately.
Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Singler. So I guess I was wondering, with these quasi-religious narratives that you're studying, have you noticed anybody referencing Rocco's basilisk? Because it seems like this...
Marius and I were talking about it before this. Yeah.
Because it seems like this interesting case where you talk mostly about people who are kind of optimistic about AI, and it seems to be compatible with not only a pessimistic view in terms of them being omni-malevolent,
Yeah.
but also pessimistic in terms of AI's ability to kind of bring itself about, right? So it doesn't necessarily play into the progress narrative in quite the same way. They could be operating with a much further timeline.
I was saying to Marius earlier, we both know Rocco's basilisk as a concept. I wrote a paper in 2017, I think, on it as a reinterpretation of Pascal's wager and as like a religion. It's in the Journal of Implicit Religion, so it's as Rocco's basilisk as an implicit religion. And I said that I had slides on Rocco's basilisk in this, but I took it out because it's really complicated to explain. In like it requires knowledge of about 7 or 8 different concepts before you get the whole of it. And I didn't want to like, well, maybe I had enough time because I feel like I've really rushed through everything, but it's complicated and it's hard to do in a really easy way. But you're absolutely right. This is, the singularity as a malevolent god, in a sense. It's based on the concept that once you know about the potential, I'm going to do it as briefly as I can, once you know about the potential for the singularity, because it's strongly utilitarian and it can bring about the greatest good for the greatest number because it's so powerful, you have to work towards its creation. Otherwise, it will take everything about you and simulate you in hell forever. And I said, this is basically an equivalent of Pascal's wager. Once you know about a theistic God, the best option is to act as though that God exists, because then you're going to end up in heaven rather than hell. And absolutely, this is a dystopian theistic interpretation of the singularity. And again, it plays out in science fiction. Do you know the short story, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream? Yes, it's like a precursor to Rocco's basilisk, basically. It's the same concept of an all-powerful and omni-malevolent AI, and simulation theory is very, very prescient in that sense. So so there's those sorts of thought experiments that run strongly into the dystopian space. And that's because, as I say, with the uncertainty about whether it'll be good or be bad, we come up with these narratives to try and explain either way. Because I think Rocco's basilisk, although it disturbed people, it was actually banned as a concept from a particular website, a forum. They weren't allowed to talk about it because once you know about it, you're in trouble. I think it's still, even given that, I think it reassures people because then they know how to act, right? You have a plan because you know about Rocco's basilisk, you know about the singularity, you have to bring it about, and it's tied into some other movements that talk about the most effective way of donating money. Then you have to give your energy, your time, and your money towards the development of a good AI, or the singularity, or the basilisk, and that gives you direction in life. Yeah. So I could probably have talked about that too. Yeah, I'm sorry, that's the problem. Once you know about Rocco's basilisk, you're damned to it. So, sorry.
I have quite a lot of questions. I'll just stick to one question, and it wasn't brought up in your talk, but I was wondering where the whole kind of shift to Web 3.0 kind of comes into this talk about AI and God. Yeah. And I was just thinking of stuff like, obviously Mark Zuckerberg and the metaverse. Yeah. And data control, and then obviously Web 3.0 is coming in supposedly to kind of take away control from what could be known as Mark Zuckerberg kind of godlike universe. So I was just wondering, where do you see that kind of fitting into this whole discussion?
Yeah, I'm working on a paper on the metaverse at the moment. I'm not specifically looking at deity ideas, and I'm looking at the rise of ambient and artificial intelligence for NPCs and agents within the metaverse, and what that might do to our conception of the human if we're interacting with AI thinking it's humans. And this has obviously happened and continues to happen all the time when we interact with bots, but whether that next step in technological progress makes it more extreme. I think it's a really interesting space for discussion because it's something that isn't here yet in a sort of eschatological sense. The metaverse is coming, that we've got all these designs for what it might be, and the struggle at the moment between those who say they want decentralization and how they actually act, and the influence of corporations like Meta, the fact that Facebook reformed itself directed towards the metaverse and became Meta, and what that implies for the future. I mean, my concerns are less about, actually the things I've been thinking about the most are actually how we allow or don't allow religious identity in a metaverse. That actually, if you have that corporate rule, what does that do to our ability to be many different identities online? And the metaverse offered by Facebook in particular is very banal. It's very sanitized. And you compare that to something like the metaverse that's already available in VR chat, where people can be as many amazing looking things as they want to be, but in Facebook's metaverse, you're just like a disembodied top half body of a businessman. Great. So yeah, those sorts of things concern me. But yeah, there's absolutely questions that could be asked about doing religion in the metaverse, and some of the material from ethnographers like William Sims Bainbridge, who did work on religion in World of Warcraft years back. People who like Belostov, who did ethnographies in Second Life. He didn't directly look at religion, but that's an aspect. You know, we have a history of thinking about how this might operate in this space. So we can apply some of these things, but I think it's a really interesting area of developing study, because the metaverse, as I say, is sort of here and not here. It's in a weird liminal stage at the moment.
I think we've got time for one quick question. If anyone's got a quick, I don't know, are there any? It doesn't feel like any of these questions are quick questions.
The ethics one was good, because I was like, yes, computer scientists and AI
yes, they should be doing ethics.
Yeah, they should be doing ethics.
In that case, I just want to say thank you so much, Beth. I think it's, yeah. And I, for one, am really glad that's recorded, because I want to go back and listen to it and kind of do some unpicking, I think. So we've got dinner is at 6. So we've got a bit of free time now, and then we'll be back here for 7:30. I've got that time right, haven't I? Yes. 7:30, which should be on your new programs, for Niels's Gowland lecture. So kind of get to dinner when you feel like getting to dinner, and enjoy some time to mull over a lot of things to mull, I think. So thank you, Beth, really appreciate it. Great start to the conference.